What a weird day today was in the news. Look at Mike Pence here. The vice president today sitting there perfectly still. And for a lot of the time, his eyes were like at half-mast, like maybe he was meditating or possibly dozing. But he just sat there without moving. He's like in Lincoln Memorial pose. And this whole kinetic, bizarre scene is unfolding around him that he took no part in whatsoever. The president and the Democratic leader of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is about to be Speaker of the House again, Democratic Senate leader, Chuck Schumer. The three of them, the two Democrats and the president, are having this big animated on-camera fight in the Oval Office in front of reporters, half talking to each other, half talking to the press. And the president, gets put in his place by Nancy Pelosi like he's a kid who doesn't understand what he's in trouble for. Chuck Schumer is basically laughing at the president, making jokes at Trump's expense to the reporters in the room while Trump is sitting there fuming. But there's the vice president, perfectly still. It's like he just left his body. He's a human-like robot, but they couldn't afford the one with the internal battery pack. He was the plug-in one, but somebody accidentally kicked the cord out of the wall, and so he just powered down and became inert. It was such a weird start to the news day. And all the more so because it's kind of a big day. We are, of course, expecting the sentencing tomorrow morning of the president's longtime personal lawyer, whose own federal case has led to federal prosecutors implicating the president himself in directing Michael Cohen to commit 2 felony campaign finance violations during the election. Cohen has since become a more than willing cooperator with the special counsel who's investigating the Russia scandal and the links between Russia and the president's campaign. But federal prosecutors in New York are nevertheless advising the judge in Cohen's case that he should get substantial prison time tomorrow, like years in prison. This is all going to come to a head tomorrow morning in federal court in New York. Today, there was also an intriguing twist in the federal felony case against the president's campaign chair, Paul Manafort. Last week, prosecutors from the special counsel's office told the judge in Manafort's case that Manafort had lied to them during the time he was supposed to be truthfully cooperating with them. They spelled out 5 separate areas in which they said Manafort has lied. Now, Manafort's own legal defense had initially contested that assertion from the special counsel's office. The defense had told the judge that Manafort believed he'd only told them the truth. But then today in court, twist. Manafort's legal team appeared to back off that assertion of his truthfulness a little bit. I had thought for sure they were going to go into court today and pound their chests and attack the prosecutors and say these are all scurrilous accusations against their client and Paul Manafort has only told the truth. That's what I expected. They did not do that at all. Manafort's defense team today instead just mildly told the judge that they're not really sure how they want to proceed. Manafort's lead defense counsel telling the judge in this hearing today that he and his fellow defense counsel, they continue to have discussions with the special counsel's office on this matter. And, quote, our conversations with the government have given us things that we need to visit with amongst ourselves and with our client about how to proceed moving forward. We need to visit about that a little kibitz. We need to have a little. So like I said, weird day. The president's longtime personal lawyer, who worked for him in his real estate business for a decade, whose case has led to the implication of the president in 2 felonies, he's due to be sentenced tomorrow. He's probably going to prison for a substantial amount of time. President's campaign chair apparently may not even contest the contention from the special counsel's office that he's been lying to prosecutors and investigators even since he has been in jail and has pled guilty to other felonies. Since lying to prosecutors and federal investigators is a crime in and of itself, if he's not going to contest that, that means he may not even be trying to put up a defense anymore, as he faces what could effectively end up being a life sentence for him in prison. In the middle of this, the vice president was wheeled out today in front of a room full of reporters, although, again, as I say, somebody forgot to plug him in. And now tonight, we are finally staring down the barrel of the sentencing of the president's first national security advisor, Mike Flynn, who prosecutors say met with them 19 times since he pled guilty. to assist them with the special counsel's investigation into Russian interference in the election, as well as a couple of other investigations that he's helping them with as well. But those ones they're keeping well hidden behind big black redaction bars in their public-facing court filings about Mike Flynn. So we knew heading into today's news day and to tonight's show, frankly, that tonight is the deadline for Mike Flynn's defense lawyers to make their own case to the judge in his case for why Flynn, yes, might be a felon, but he's a good felon. And he's been so helpful to prosecutors, he just shouldn't go to prison. Just as we were getting on the air, we got notice from the official court docket in Flynn's case that that document has now been filed. It's not yet obtainable. We can't yet grab it off the docket, but we are in the process of obtaining it right this second, basically by praying to the internet gods that control these things. So we think we're going to have that Flynn sentencing memo imminently. Certainly while we're on the hour, while we're on the air this hour, we're going to get some expert help once we've got it to try to parse what that might mean. But while we're trying to download the Flynn sentencing document, remember how we got here. It wasn't even 1 month into the new Trump administration when Flynn had to resign from the White House, right? And then we soon learned from Sally Yates in unbelievably dramatic congressional testimony that just a few days after Trump was inaugurated, it was counterintelligence worries about Mike Flynn that precipitated an incredibly dramatic White House showdown within the first week of the Trump administration. Then acting Attorney General Sally Yates and another justice official who we believe was probably the head of the National Security Division at the Justice Department, they came to the White House, not even a week into Trump being in office. They came to the White House to warn the brand new Trump administration that the highest-ranking national security official in the new administration was compromised by the Russian government. I mean, what Sally Yates brought to the White House in those first few days when Trump was in office was just remarkable news. That the new national security advisor had secretly been in contact with the Russian government about U.S. sanctions against Russia, and he was lying about those contacts publicly. And he appeared to have been lying about those contacts to other senior officials inside the Trump administration as well. And yes, lying itself is bad. It's a bad thing. You have to answer for that at the end of the day. But lying isn't necessarily a counterintelligence emergency for the country. The reason why Mike Flynn was a counterintelligence emergency for the country right at the start of the Trump administration was because he wasn't just lying about his contacts with Russia in the abstract. He was lying about those contacts. He was denying those contacts while Russia knew the truth. I mean, the Russian government knew exactly what he had been talking to them about. Russia knew that he was lying about those contacts publicly, that he was trying to keep those contacts secret. And so that, of course, gave Russia something that they could lord over Mike Flynn, something they could use to coerce him or blackmail him or just threaten him in order to get him to do what they wanted. So already in the first calendar week of the new presidency, we had a national security emergency in the White House, unlike anything that has ever happened before in this country. I mean, the Justice Department coming to the White House with hard, cold, incontrovertible evidence that the top national security official in the administration was compromised by a hostile foreign power. I mean, that's like beep-boo, beep-boo, flashing red lights, bells and whistles. I mean, as a country, we don't even have pre-made alarm bells for that kind of emergency. With this thing happen with Flynn, we had to make new alarm bells, wait for them to cool, and then start ringing them. Because nothing like that had ever happened before in our country. And one of the first mysteries about the Mike Flynn counterintelligence emergency in the White House was the response to that warning they got about him, or the lack thereof. After the White House received that incredibly disturbing, absolutely unprecedented emergency warning about the national security advisor, the reaction inside the White House was nothing. No visible reaction at all for 18 days after the White House was warned that the national security advisor was compromised by a hostile foreign power. Apparently, the Trump White House allowed Flynn not only to stay in his job, but they continued to allow him access to the most highly classified information in the U.S. government, while the Russian government had leverage over him that could presumably induce them to get anything they wanted out of him. I mean, that was a really strange reaction for the White House to have to that overt warning. And it gave rise to a whole succession of events and unexplained behavior that we still don't understand, more than a year and a half since that situation blew up with Mike Flynn, and now as we stand on the precipice of his sentencing. I mean, why was there no reaction from the White House? No public or apparently even private recognition within the White House of the seriousness of what they had just been told about the National Security Advisor. I mean, once the Washington Post broke the news of how the Justice Department had issued this warning to the White House, once they broke the news about what Flynn was suspected of doing and what the national security emergency was about Flynn, once the Washington Post went public with it and Flynn therefore finally had to step down, why then did President Trump ask James Comey, the director of the FBI at the time, to please go easy on Flynn? Hope you can let this go. Why did he do that? It's also been reported that the president additionally asked the director of national intelligence, Dan Coats, if he too could please intercede with the FBI to somehow make them go easy on Mike Flynn, not go after Mike Flynn. Why did the president intercede to do that on Flynn's behalf, given what we had all just learned about Flynn? Why did the president initially say that Mike Flynn was fired because he had lied to Mike Pence about his contacts with Russia? But then later, the president changed his story to say he had to fire Flynn because actually Flynn lied to the FBI. Frankly, why did Mike Flynn lie at all about his contacts with the Russian government about sanctions? Right? He's the incoming national security advisor. It wouldn't be that weird for Flynn to be talking to a foreign government about an expected change in policy under the Trump administration when it came to U.S.-Russia relations, even sanctions specifically. I mean, it'd be a little awkward. Questions would be raised, but it wouldn't be that weird. Nevertheless, he lied about it publicly, and he lied about it to the FBI. And that honestly makes no sense if they were innocent policy discussions about sanctions and he's the incoming advisor who's going to be working on that stuff. I mean, you wouldn't need to keep that stuff secret. You wouldn't even need to try to keep it secret. Unless perhaps those sanctions discussions were maybe linked to something that really truly couldn't get out and had to be kept secret. And it certainly couldn't be disclosed to the FBI. I mean, the reason I raise that possibility, and the reason I think this is important as we head into the sentencing portion of Mike Flynn's life, is that it wasn't just Mike Flynn who lied about those sanctions discussions. I mean, it's troubling and interesting and intriguing enough that Flynn was lying about those discussions with Russia. But it wasn't just him. Right? As Flynn is about to be sentenced, I think maybe this is the most important part. This time last year, the New York Times reported on emails that were circulated among senior Trump transition staff at the time Flynn was making those contacts with the Russian government. These emails showed that in fact, multiple senior officials knew at the time that Flynn was talking to the Russian government about sanctions. Emails about his conversations with Russia, about his sanctions conversations with Russia, were reportedly circulating among Flynn and his top deputy in the National Security Council, K.T. McFarland. Also looped into the conversation was another Trump transition advisor named Tom Bossert, also Reince Priebus, who would go on to be the chief of staff, and Sean Spicer, who would go on to be the press secretary, and Steve Bannon, who would go on to play the Grim Reaper in the Saturday Night Live skits about the new administration. They all knew. They all knew at the time that Flynn was talking to the Russian government about sanctions during the transition. They all knew it while he was doing it and while Flynn was lying about it. A number of them helped spread the lies about it, including K.T. McFarland, who lied publicly about it, who lied to reporters about it, who lied to the U.S. Senate about it, and who ultimately lied to the FBI about it. She later revised her statement to the FBI after she initially told them lies. Sean Spicer also lied to the public about it from the White House press room. Then White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus also lied about it to the American public.
But I have talked to General Flynn. None of that came up. The subject matter of sanctions or the actions taken by the Obama administration did not come up in the conversation. In fact, it was the sports team that was in an unfortunate plane accident.
So there was no challenge of American policy currently by Mr. Flynn with the Russian ambassador. Okay, one final question.
No,
There's a
no,
new
sir.
No, sir. No, sir. None. No challenge of American policy currently by Mr. Flynn with the Russian ambassador. Nope. No, sir. None. That was not true. And Reince Priebus had been looped in on communications during the transition, specifically about Flynn talking to the Russians about sanctions while they were happening. So while he's maintaining to the public, no, I checked with Flynn, he definitely didn't do that. Reince Priebus had been in on those conversations, had been looped into those communications about the fact that Flynn was in fact talking to the Russia and about that. And so was Sean Spicer, and so was Tom Bossert, and so was Katie McFarland, and so were other people in the transition. They all knew while Flynn lied about it publicly. They all knew while Flynn got in trouble for lying about it publicly. They all told their own lies about it publicly. And again, talking to Russia about sanctions shouldn't have been a secret at all. Why were they all keeping it secret? And on top of all of that, the person whose role in all of this is perhaps most implausible and therefore most troubling is actually the vice president, Mr. Roboto, today, Mike Pence. While more than half a dozen senior officials in the transition were overtly discussing Flynn's contacts with the Russian government about sanctions, Mike Pence was the head of the transition. But he says he knew nothing about that, never heard about any of that, no idea. When another controversy about Flynn arose, and Flynn had to retroactively register as a foreign agent who'd been secretly working for Turkey during the presidential campaign, Flynn's lawyers said they notified the transition multiple times, including in writing, about Flynn's ties to that foreign government as well. Again, Mike Pence was the head of the transition, which is the entity that was notified about Flynn's foreign ties, right? But Mike Pence says, yeah, I had no idea about that. Never heard about it. You are running the transition, and it turns out the national security advisor, the incoming national security advisor, has secret, undisclosed foreign ties that he's under federal investigation for. That doesn't rise to your level? What else were you busy with? Similarly, Mike Pence publicly denied that there had ever been any role in the transition for Mike Flynn's son, Mike Jr., after one of many instances in which Mike Jr. achieved press attention and some notoriety for controversial public statements. Mike Pence was running the transition. He said overtly that Mike Flynn's son never had any role in the transition, but in fact he had. Some of the stuff he later got in trouble for were messages that he sent from his official transition email address. Vice President Pence trying to preserve some sort of deniable fiction about that was just inexplicable and embarrassing at the time. But it's ended up being just one of a whole bunch of things that the vice president has said specifically about Mike Flynn that turned out to be utterly implausible or just flat out false.
What's the level of concern within your national security apparatus about General Flynn's son?
Well, General Flynn's son has no involvement in the transition whatsoever.
He has a transition email.
Well, he has no involvement in the transition whatsoever.
Not at all.
General Flynn is
let me ask you that again.
Of our team,
I just want to underline that. You're running the transition, right?
I am. I'm chairing it.
Okay.
So you were
but
saying,
seriously,
as the head of the transition, that Flynn's son is not involved at all in the transition?
No, he's not. And I said this morning that his son had no involvement in the transition, but I've talked to General Flynn, and his son was helping him a bit with scheduling and administrative items, but that's no longer the case. Look, all of our families want to be helpful.
You're downplaying his role, but you must be aware that the transition team put in for security clearance for Michael G. Flynn, the son of Lieutenant General Flynn.
Well, I'm aware in talking to General Flynn that his son was helping with scheduling, Jake.
No, but you put in for security clearance for him.
He was helping his dad arrange for meetings and provide meetings, but that's no longer the case.
But do you need security clearance to do scheduling?
I think that's the appropriate decision for us to move forward, avoid any further distractions.
But I'm afraid I just didn't get an answer, which is, were you aware that the transition had put in for a security clearance for Michael Flynn Jr.?
You know, I've worked very closely with General Flynn. We've met on many occasions. I've never seen his son present for any of those meetings.
But you're head of the transition team, so you know who you put in for security clearances for.
Well, General Flynn did inform me that his son was helping on administrative matters.
The last question on this, sir, and I'm sorry, you're not answering the question, which is, were you aware that the transition team had put in for a security clearance? I mean, this is a young man who had a social media profile that had all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories, that had all sorts of links and retweets with white supremacists. were you aware that the transition put in for a security clearance for him?
Well, what I can tell you is that in talking with General Flynn today, he made me aware that his son was assisting him in scheduling
And that you'd put in for a security
meetings.
Can somebody please remove my power cord, move me over to a corner, and turn me around so I can pop me in the closet maybe, or up onto a high shelf? Pence needs to power down now. Do not want to answer questions about this now. The cover story for what happened to Mike Flynn and why he finally got pushed out of the Trump administration after an utterly implausible public-facing series of events was that it was somehow a great problem in the Trump administration that Mike Flynn had lied to Vice President Mike Pence. And as strange as that seems, it is probably now a more important question to figure out why Vice President Pence has told so many public lies about Mike Flynn. And as we now tonight get to find out if the sentencing of Flynn, the final dispensation of this case, is going to tell us why that is, we have just obtained the filings from Flynn's defense counsel in terms of how he should be sentenced. It's like 157 pages or something. We just got it. We'll go through that document with some expert help. Next, stay with us.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.